At 18 years old, I was definitely far from being a mature, reasonable kid. I constantly got into fights with my parents over absolutely nothing, always managing to make things far more dramatic than they needed to be. And this particular day was especially rough. The argument escalated to the point where my parents basically kicked me out for the day. And in my immature, stubborn mindset, I decided I was going to prove a point by not coming back. I didn't know if that meant staying away for just the night, a few days, or what I was even planning to do. I clearly hadn't thought it through. I was just upset. After walking around town for a while, kicking rocks, and eventually calming down, I realized the sun was gone, and I needed somewhere to spend the night. I had friends I was sure would let me crash at their place, but I knew their parents would call mine and turn this into an even bigger situation, which I wanted to avoid. Again, not my smartest thinking. The first place that came to mind where I could be alone was an old house that had been vacant for as long as I could remember. I had actually explored it a few times years ago with friends, and during the day it was never all that creepy, just an empty home. I figured checking it out and maybe staying there for the night would work, even if I didn't sleep and just stayed up until morning. The house sat on what used to be a normal neighborhood street, but the road had been cut off years ago and marked as a dead end. Beyond that was an abandoned, overgrown driveway leading straight to the property. I got there around 10 p.m., and since this was obviously illegal, I checked my surroundings the entire way and made sure I was alone before sneaking past the gate and onto the property. Surrounded by trees, the house was almost completely buried in bushes. I could barely see it until I was right next to it, like the forest was swallowing it whole from the ground up. From what I could tell, though, it looked exactly as I remembered. The broken door I'd used years ago was still hanging open, and the inside appeared untouched. But at night, it was creepy as hell. It was incredibly dark, and every other door and window was boarded up. The moment I stepped inside, I knew there was no way I'd be sleeping there, but I was intrigued enough to stay and look around anyway. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping to find, just something interesting, I guess. After only a few minutes, I reached the staircase and started heading upstairs when I suddenly heard a couple of creaks from the floor I had just been on. I froze. They were definitely footsteps. Then, after a quiet pause, I heard a door open somewhere near the side of the house, close to the one I had entered through. A shiver ran through my entire body. Whoever was down there was now standing right by my only way out, and I stayed frozen halfway up the steps, waiting to see what would happen. I still hoped maybe they didn't know I was there and would go back into whatever room they had come from so I could make a quick exit. But even more eerie than hearing them move around was not hearing them move at all. It felt like they were waiting for me. After what felt like 10 full minutes, my mind started convincing me that maybe they had quietly gone back into the room, or maybe there wasn't anyone there at all and the door had opened on its own. Either way, I knew I had to leave eventually, even if it meant running past someone and sprinting straight out the door. I slowly stepped down to the bottom of the stairs and peeked around the corner, not seeing anyone at first. Then I moved to the next corner and looked toward the open doorway, and there he was. A man stood directly in front of it, already staring at me. Before I could even react, he called out, telling me to stop where I was. It was dark, but I could tell he wasn't wearing normal clothes. He had on a uniform, and I instantly realized he was supposed to be a cop. "You shouldn't be here, kid. Why are you out here?" he asked, his voice deep but slightly slurred. Nervously, I apologized and said I would leave right away. He stood still for a moment, as if thinking about my answer, before stepping toward me.
"Did you come here alone?" The way he said it sent chills through me. Now that he was closer, his uniform looked off, distressed and loose, like it didn't fit him properly, almost as if it wasn't even his. He was tall but skinny, and shadows covered his entire body, including his face, making it impossible to see his eyes. "I asked you a question. Speak up." His voice grew deeper and more demanding, and terrified, I told him it was just me. He stepped closer again. And what was it you were looking for out here?" I shook my head, unsure what to say. After a second, I saw his face shift in the darkness, like he was smiling, before he turned and walked toward the room he had come out of. It was completely pitch black inside. He leaned against the doorframe and said, in a half-friendly, half-horrifying tone, "Come here." I didn't move. He straightened up and pushed the door open wider, repeating himself. At that point, everything in me knew he wasn't a real cop, and now that he had moved, he wasn't blocking the front door anymore. He was still just a few feet away from it, but I took my chance. I sprinted straight for the exit. As I passed him, I saw his arm shoot out and felt his hand grab the collar of my shirt, choking me for a split second before he lost his grip and I slipped away. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods and across town, finally making it home, where I was met with a police car already in the driveway. My parents had reported me missing after I didn't come home, and none of my friends' parents had heard from me. Still horrified and in shock from what had just happened, I didn't say anything. I was also scared to admit I had broken into the abandoned house and possibly run from another officer, even though I was 99% sure he was fake. The fact that the two real cops never questioned me about the vacant house should have told me everything, because if he had been real, every officer in the area would have already had my description. I take full responsibility for the danger I put myself in that night, purely out of being a dumb teenager, but I don't think I deserved whatever was waiting for me in that room had I assumed he was a cop and listened to the man inside that house.
For the first 20-ish years of my life, I grew up in a very small countryside town where it was always quiet and nothing ever really happened. Honestly, it was a really boring place to live, especially as a kid, because there was barely anything to do. So when I was 17 or 18 during summer break, my best friend Marcus and I came up with what can only be described as a horrible idea. Almost on a whim, we decided to check out an abandoned place on the outskirts of town, somewhere everyone in the area knew about. In fact, I think it was the only truly abandoned structure around. Aside from the exaggerated, probably made-up stories people told about it, all Marcus and I really knew was that it was an old farmhouse from the very early 1900s, sitting on a massive plot of land, something like 200 acres. The owners had passed away decades ago, long before I was even born, and although the county had bought the land, they never did anything with it. They simply put up a fence and warning signs all around it that read, "State property, no trespassing." So anytime you drove on any of the surrounding roads, you'd see this old dilapidated farmhouse rotting away in the middle of a wide open field in the distance. Completely bored out of our minds, Marcus and I just wanted to explore the place. It was a dumb idea. We weren't looking for trouble or planning to mess anything up, but curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed flashlights, took Marcus's car to the edge of town, parked off the road, and walked about a mile to where the farm was. We knew cops sometimes patrolled the area, so instead of approaching through the wide-open grassy field, we followed the fence all the way around to the back, where it met a wooded area, minimizing the time we'd be exposed in the open. Seeing the place up close for the first time after only viewing it from far away my entire life was surreal. All the wood had weathered down to a nearly black color with no paint left, vines and weeds climbing up the walls, but surprisingly, it looked relatively stable. The roof wasn't caving in and the walls seemed intact. We hurried along the side of the farmhouse and found an open window to climb through. We didn't even bother testing the front door, assuming it was locked and still trying to stay low profile. I climbed in first and helped Marcus through, and then we both stood silently by the window for a moment, slowly moving our flashlights around while listening. Dust floated through the air in the beams of our lights, and it was completely silent inside. After a few seconds, we started walking around. The floors felt sturdy, but still bowed and creaked with almost every step, and Marcus and I kept glancing at each other. I think we both had a deep, unsettling feeling about the place now that we were actually inside, but neither of us said anything for the first couple of minutes until Marcus suddenly whispered my name. "Sam, come look at this. What is that?" He pointed up toward the ceiling, and between the floorboards above us was a very dim orange light, barely glowing through the cracks in the wood. It didn't even give off much illumination. You could only see it if you stood directly underneath it. We were both weirded out, but also curious. How could there possibly be a light in here after all these years? We should have known to leave right then, but instead we slowly made our way upstairs.
But beneath one of them was a brighter orange glow flickering through the gap under the door. Obviously, this was another sign to leave, and we were stupid not to. But what kept us there was the silence. It was truly dead silent. The entire time we had been inside, there hadn't been a single sound that didn't come from either of us. And in a place like this, we should have heard if we weren't alone. I even walked up to the door and pressed my ear against it, but I didn't hear anything. So I turned the handle and slowly pushed it open. The heavy creaking sound echoed through the entire house, and my eyes instantly widened. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I was completely horrified. There was a group of people on their knees, huddled together in a circle. I think there were 3 men with a few candles lit around the room. Even then, I could hardly see much, just their shapes gathered in the middle, and they were completely motionless. Even after the loud creak of the door opening and Marcus and I walking around upstairs for the last 5 minutes, they didn't move or even turn to look at us. It was like they were frozen or asleep or something. I stared for maybe 3 seconds before Marcus pulled me away, and we both hurried back down the stairs, running but still trying to be quiet for some reason. Every sound we made felt amplified by the adrenaline rushing through us. We got to the window, and Marcus quickly climbed out, and just as I started to follow, I heard multiple heavy thumps of footsteps running out of the room and down the stairs. I practically dove out of the window, and then we both sprinted straight for the woods. After getting far enough in to slow down and catch our breath, we suddenly heard a loud thud coming from back at the farmhouse. We assumed it might have been the open window slamming shut behind us, but we can't say for sure. The walk back was awful. We both had headaches from the intensity of what had just happened and couldn't even begin to make sense of what we saw. Marcus dropped me off at home, and strangely, after a few days, we never really talked about it again. I think we just wanted to forget it even happened. After finishing high school, I moved away for college, and several years later, when I passed by the old farm, the house was gone. I hope I did well enough describing everything, because it was genuinely the most horrifying experience I've ever had, and probably ever will have.
This happened while I was traveling through the West Coast with the sole purpose of going on as many backpacking trips as possible. I had taken an entire month off and lined up multiple trails to explore. Most of them were regular hiking and camping routes, except for one. A friend of mine, who's just as adventurous and really into camping, had told me about an abandoned mining town that sounded incredibly interesting. Now, there are tons of old mining towns scattered all over the West from the sporadic gold rushes, and I had already visited dozens of them by that point in my life. But this one was different. It wasn't out in the desert or perched on a sandy, rocky hillside. This town was tucked deep into the mountains and buried within a forest, which is actually really rare to find and makes places like this almost never visited by regular people or tourists. So if you're looking for completely undisturbed, raw, abandoned structures, these are basically the jackpot. It sounded amazing. And even better, it was only a few miles off one of the trails I was already backpacking, making it well worth the hike up to check out before heading back down to my campsite afterward. I got there around midday, and although it was cloudy, which definitely gave the abandoned town a more unsettling appearance, it was still one of the coolest things I had seen in a while. After all the time the forest had to regrow around it, the small cabin homes looked like they had become part of the landscape itself. It had clearly been abandoned and left untouched for over a century, and you could even tell that no one had really visited or explored it. There were no footpaths or trails connecting the homes, and everything was quiet and completely still.
I walked past the first few houses and approached one that was mostly intact, even containing some old furniture, like a wooden rocking chair and wooden shelves. I spent another half hour walking around, but the entire time I had this deeply unsettling feeling looming over me, the kind that makes you constantly turn around to check behind you, like someone might be lurking nearby, watching your every move. Still, it was easy to brush it off as just the natural creepiness of being alone in a forgotten mining town, especially one buried deep in the forest, instead of sitting out in the open like most others I'd visited. Eventually, I reached the end of the town, where there was an opening in the trees, and right there in the side of the mountain was the entrance to the mine. It was insane how instantly dark it became inside. From where I stood outside, I could only see maybe 5 feet down the tunnel before it faded into complete blackout darkness. Before entering, I paused at the opening for a minute and heard a sound coming from deep within the mine, a low, constant, almost deep rumbling noise, like something echoing through the entire tunnel system. It was incredibly unsettling, almost as if I could feel it resonating inside me the closer I got to the entrance.
It filled me with a sense of dread that genuinely freaked me out. My eyes even started to feel strange the longer I stared into the darkness, like they were trying to focus on something, but it was so black that I think they began making up shapes in the void. I only took a couple of steps inside before my entire body stiffened up and refused to let me go any further, so I quickly turned back and left the tunnel. I hurried back through the abandoned town, constantly glancing over my shoulder at the mine entrance as the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I didn't bother exploring anything else and made my way back to the trail where I had set up camp. With only a couple hours of daylight left, I made some food, prepped everything for the next day's hike, gathered sticks for a fire, and lit it up. I didn't try to rationalize the sound or the feeling I had experienced. Instead, I just buried it, knowing it would be dangerous to let paranoia set in right before sunset. I sat by the fire, poking at the flames with a stick and listening to the calm forest around me. About 2 hours passed, and then the forest became anything but calming. I started hearing animal sounds, which normally wouldn't have bothered me, but that night, something felt off. Specifically, there was an elk somewhere nearby that would bellow every few minutes, its call echoing through the entire forest. It didn't sound like it was moving. It always came from the same spot behind me, somewhere in the general direction of the mining town. It gave me chills every time. And then, suddenly it stopped for maybe 15 to 20 minutes. The silence allowed my thoughts to wander again until a sudden, sharp snapping sound pulled me right out of my head. I shot my eyes toward the noise, and somehow my immediate first thought was that someone had followed me back to my camp. I don't know why, because I hadn't seen anyone or had any real reason to believe that, but it was like I knew it in my gut. Something was wrong. I stood up and tried to peer as intently as I could into the darkness, but after a few seconds, I said, "Forget it," and started packing my things. For the entire 5 minutes or so that I packed, nothing happened. No more noises, no sightings. But out there, alone in the backcountry, you can't afford to ignore your instincts. I strapped everything up, put on my headlamp, and kicked dirt over the fire to smother it. And the moment the flames went out, I heard footsteps sprinting toward me from the exact direction where I had heard the snap. My headlamp didn't reach nearly far enough to see anything, so after a split second, I turned and started running down the trail. I ran for quite a while, but I never heard whoever it was follow me onto the trail. It seemed like they stayed back after I took off. I honestly couldn't believe my gut had been right the entire time. Someone had been out there watching me and following me. The hike down wasn't too bad, but on no sleep, it was harder than it should have been. I made it back to my car by early morning and got out of that forest. Later, I told the friend who had mentioned the place what happened, and he kind of thought I was crazy, although he admitted he had never actually gone up to the mine tunnel or camped anywhere near it. Afterward, he also mentioned that the elk I heard might have been calling out because it saw someone else in the forest and was making a territorial call, which, come to think of it, probably should have been my sign that something was wrong and that I needed to leave. Whatever the case, that mining town is probably best left alone and forgotten.